Greetings, Jellyspoons, and welcome back to this very special Halloween episode of Monday Madness. As you can probably tell, I have been working a lot this month, pretty much 31 days straight. So today I am here to bring you a improvised Halloween story. I hope you enjoy. Once upon a time, in a faraway land, shrouded in almost complete darkness, where though the sun rose and set each day, the clouds hung so low and so thick that it was as though a mist obscured the light of the day. There was a dark, dark castle, which sat alone and crumbling on a tall mountainside. None of the locals dared to approach. The place never received post nor visitors, and any who attempted to explore the ruined place did not return. The dark castle sat at the eye of the storm, always and forever surrounded by a wreath of clouds and smoke, but penetrating right through the center, a beam of moonlight could be seen shimmering across the marble stone walls. But during the fleeting daylit hours, the mist would close back in once again, and the entire castle would be shrouded in fog. And then, one day, something strange happened. A prince in the neighboring kingdom had just been married to the love of his life, and to celebrate, he was determined to get him and his bride a castle all of their very own. He had scoured the land, but all were either occupied or destroyed by war. And then he heard tell that there was one castle that may be claimed by him. And so he rode to the dark lands, shrouded in mist and smoke, and he came to the foot of the mountain on which the dark castle stood. He dismounted his horse, leaving it at the foot of the mountain to graze, while he alone climbed up in his shimmering armor. Up and up he climbed, and as he climbed up and up, slowly the grass and dirt made way for ice and snow. He slipped and skidded. He tumbled back down the mountain. Eventually, he had to leave most of his armor behind, scouring the rest of the way in just his shirt and breeches. Eventually, after many, many hours of climbing, he reached the dark castle. There was a candle flickering in one of the upmost windows, and so the newly wedded prince scrambled to his feet and approached the large wooden doors. He knocked with the iron handle. The sound echoed down a seemingly endless maze of corridors and passageways within, and after what felt like an eternity, the prince heard footsteps approaching the other side of the door. The prince valiantly held his breath as the large double doors swung slowly open, to reveal a hooded figure stood gripping a candle on the other side of the door. The creature had large dark eyes and long dark hair. It stood staring at the prince for a great moment before it spoke. "What brings you knocking on my door?" The prince, finding his tongue, spoke up at once, proclaiming just who he was, that he was the prince of the neighboring kingdom, and that his father the king had given him permission to seek out his own castle wherever he could find one. He intended to take over this very castle now, and live in it with his new bride. The creature listened to all this with a small smile forming at the tips of its lips, and when the prince had finished, the creature inclined its head and asked, "And you are just expecting me to hand over my castle for nothing in return?" The prince, ashamedly, had not thought of this, But, valiant and honourable as he was, he immediately stated that he would of course do anything the creature wished, and asked what would be the price for the castle it resided in. Dark eyes roamed the prince up and down before the creature replied simply, "I want brushes made of the finest bird feathers. I want paints forged from every color of the ores of the earth, and I want charcoal of the purest ebony taken from the heart of a dead volcano." The prince was confused by this rather odd list of requests, but he had asked the creature what it wanted, and now he had been told. So, a quest was upon him, and the prince loved nothing more than a good quest, apart from his new wife, of course. And so, thanking the creature, he turned and scaled his way slowly back down the mountain, putting on his suit of armor and jumping onto the back of his noble horse. And so the prince set off. The first of the items he thought should be the simplest. He knew of a secluded lake only half a mile within the borders of his own kingdom, which was the birthplace and the home of some of the finest birds in the world. Their feathers grew so soft and fine that all across the land, even just one feather from one of those birds could fetch a steep price. They were used to forge the finest writing quills, to stuff the most luxurious plump pillows, and of course to act as bristles in the brushes of the most magnificent painters across the entire world. The prince and his steed rode on and on through that dark, desolate kingdom, until they reached a break in the clouds and the warmer skies that marked the borders of his own lands once again. He turned to the south, and soon found his way to that secluded, protected lake, where he came across a gaggle of the beautiful birds. It did not take long to catch one unawares. The birds have a distinctly amiable nature, and enjoy the company of most creatures, including people. The prince approached slowly, beckoning his hands, offering some of his food, and slowly a group of 2 or 3 birds surrounded him. He was able to pluck some of their feathers and pick the rest from the floor, until he held half a dozen in his hand. The prince stored the feathers carefully away in his pocket, and then, returning to his steed, set off once again for the next location. The prince had never made paint before, but as he rode he began to think back on the stories he had been told as a child. Stories of the northern dwarves who dwelled deep under the ground in mines of their own creation, digging deeper and deeper into the earth, discovering diamonds, rocks, and ores, and transforming them into all manner of strange things. He turned and began to ride north. He rode, and as the days wore on, the weather began to change. In his own kingdom, each of the 4 seasons arrived once a year, each taking their turn upon the land and then making way for the next. But the further north he travelled, into the dwarven territories, the less and less he saw any distinction between the seasons. There was no rain, there was no real sun, there was barely even any whisper of wind. There was just pale blue skies and a scattering of grey clouds. The prince soon realized, of course, that there would be no signs of life on the ground. All the dwarves were dwelling miles beneath the hooves of his horse. As that idea began to fully settle in the prince's mind, he began to wonder how he would get down into the dwarven city. On and on he rode, until they reached the dead center of the northern kingdom. Here, the earth began to dip down into the ground, like a sinkhole that went on and on into the gloom below. He rode down and down in a large arcing spiral, until soon they could no longer see the sky above them, and all was inky blackness. Suddenly, the horse came to an abrupt halt, pricking up his ears. The prince removed his helmet and listened intently too. There it was, the unmistakable sound of hammering, drumming, and the low, guttural singing of the dwarves. The prince hurried his horse, and the pair rode down and down into the unknown, until eventually the rock evened out, and they found themselves on flat, hard ground. They followed the candlelit passageways as the singing and sounds of work grew louder and louder. Eventually, they made their way to one of the entrances of a vast, deep canyon. The rock was split in a great ravine which ran for miles upon miles, down and down into the earth, and off in all directions, all except up. He saw tracks had been built into the mountainside, paths for carts to carry glistening piles of rocks, diamonds, and other ores up and down. As he looked around in wonder, he noticed signs pointing the way down various stretches and pathways and ravines, and the more he looked again, he saw exactly where he needed to go. The prince took note of 7 passageways, each marked with a signpost marking the way to the mine within. Red, yellow, green, orange, purple, and blue. The dwarves, it turned out, were remarkably friendly towards the prince. Many of the dwarves remembered the prince's father, the king, and some of the more ancient ones had even attended the man's coronation. And of course, when he explained his plight, they were only too happy to help him retrieve the ores necessary to make the paints. It took them a little under an hour to retrieve all the necessary colours. The prince checked and double-checked time and again that he did in fact have every single one. Then the dwarves taught him how to crush each ore gently between 2 large stone slabs of granite, where each ore was ground into a fine dust, and then swept into a jar, where they were mixed with 2 drops of glistening honey and a splash of ice-cold water to create the mixture ready for painting. Once the prince had all the paints stored carefully away in his saddlebags, he thanked the dwarves immensely and promised that they were all welcome to visit him when he acquired his new castle. And then he set off once more to locate the 3rd and final item on the creature's list, the charcoal from a dead volcano. This, it turned out, was not an easy task. The only volcano the prince knew of was most certainly active and avoided by all across the lands. He ended up travelling far to the west, following rumour upon rumour, until eventually he found the Dead City. This place was thought by most to be the stuff of myth or legend, but as the clip, clop, of the prince's horse's hooves slowly turned into a muffled sort of dragging noise, the prince looked around and realized that the rumors had all indeed been true. This place was no legend. This place was a horror story. It was a ghost city, an empty shell of where once had been life. The vast city stood exactly where it had been for many, many decades. Only now it was blackened, ashy, and covered in a film of white, snow-like powder. Everything was preserved horribly, like a ghastly nightmare, as the prince rode silently with his head bowed through the streets. As he guided his horse through the center square, he noted the fountain and the statues standing all around it. But no, these were not statues at all. They were lying prostrate on the ground, coiled and curled around each other, blackened and dirty, and covered in that thick layer of white ash. Upon realizing what they were, The prince offered a silent prayer to any gods who could hear him. The horse rode on slowly through the narrow streets until they reached the back and far end of the city, coming out onto a great sloping hill which led them up and up and up, passing long grooves in the earth where magma had once trailed down towards the damned city, until they reached the top and peered down into the smouldering remains of the now dead volcano. The only thing that kept the prince moving, rather than turning away from the sight never to look upon it again, was the thought of his new bride, delight upon her face as she entered the castle he had procured for her. He dismounted his horse and descended slowly into the depths of the dead volcano, scooping up a handful of charcoal rocks and thrusting them into his pocket without looking at them. The place seemed full of whispers and memory, screaming cries of those the volcano had claimed before it itself had died. The prince hoped that somehow the volcano itself had suffered. Over a week later, the prince was once again back in the dark, dark kingdom on the dark mountainside, knocking once again on the tall, dark doors of the dark, dark castle. Just as before, footsteps slowly padded across the entranceway, and the doors creaked open. Lit by candlelight, the hooded creature smiled down at the prince. "Did you get all that I asked for?" The prince nodded. "Well then, won't you come in?" The creature with dark eyes and dark hair beckoned, and the prince entered the dark castle. The door slammed shut behind him. As the hooded creature with dark eyes led the prince up a winding, wide staircase onto a balcony on the next floor, the prince stared around him and realized just how cold and dead the place felt. He was led through a set of double doors, and the prince found himself in a desolate sitting room. The creature motioned to the prince, inviting him to sit down in a large armchair. The creature watched, reclining back, leaning on the mantelpiece, over a fireplace that was quite empty. The prince began to speak, explaining that he had retrieved the items that the creature wanted, and now he hoped that it would leave the castle in peace so that he could bring his new bride and they could enjoy their new home. The hooded creature by the empty fireplace smiled. Faltering a little, the prince went on. He looked around the room and indicated some of the large portraits and paintings hanging on the walls. He said he hoped that the creature would be able to create more works of art, just as stunning and magnificent as those around them. After all, he had procured the finest supplies. Still, the creature watched him with a smile toying at its lips. The prince asked if the creature was an artist. The creature by the empty fireplace shook its head. It was then that he realized the hood had come down. The dark eyes had widened, and the prince could see a flash of pointed, razor-sharp teeth. No. The dark-eyed creature was suddenly sat next to the prince, leaning down over the arm of the chair, and the prince knew that he could neither move nor speak. "I," the dark-eyed creature went on, cold breath tickling the prince's throat. "I can only draw blood." I hope you all enjoyed that Halloween story. Yes, it was all built around a pun. I am not sorry. I have had a long month. Let me have this one, okay? As always, if you would like to support me in my chaos, then head on over to my Ko-fi or my Patreon. My commissions are open for personalised in-character messages, and if you would like me to make you a costume, hit up my Instagram DMs for more information. Thank you, my wonderful Jellyspoons. I hope you had a wonderful Halloween. I will be back to tip-top form creating proper content in the next few weeks. Goodbye.
Okay.
Okay, I'm nearly at the end. I can do this. Okay.